It was the kind of quiet suburban neighborhood where every lawn was trimmed to perfection, the sidewalks were clean, and nothing out of the ordinary ever seemed to happen. Bradford Heights was a small community in upstate New York, home to upper-middle-class families who had built their lives around security, comfort, and predictability. Why the houses were modern, sprawling structures set back from the road, each with their own patches of greenery and driveways lined with sedans and SUVs. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved politely as they passed each other on their morning jogs or walked their dogs. The veneer of normalcy was thick, almost suffocating. But behind the manicured lawns and picket fences, secrets festered, and one secret, in particular, would soon explode into a scandal that would rock the community to its core, leaving one man dead and another behind bars. The heart of the story revolved around the Reynolds family, Susan Reynolds, her teenage son, Marcus, and the boy's best friend, Jake Dawson. To the outside world, Susan Reynolds was a picture-perfect mother. She was in her mid-40s, a beautiful woman with sharp green eyes and perfectly styled dark hair. She had worked hard to maintain her figure, which she prided herself on, attending yoga classes and spending long hours at the local gym. She had built a career as a successful real estate agent, selling homes to affluent families just like hers. To everyone who knew her, she seemed like the kind of woman who had it all: beauty, success, and a loving family. Marcus, her son, was just beginning to figure out his own path in life. He was 18, about to graduate high school, and like most teenagers, he was caught between the carefree joy of youth and the looming pressure of adulthood. Tall, lanky, and a bit introverted, Marcus preferred video games to social gatherings and had a small circle of friends he trusted. Chief among them was Jake Dawson, his best friend since childhood. Jake, a year older than Marcus, was the polar opposite of his quiet friend. Athletic, charming, and effortlessly popular, Jake was the kind of guy who seemed to breeze through life without ever trying too hard. He was on the school's football team, but he wasn't the jock stereotype. His good looks and easy-going personality made him a magnet for attention, especially from girls. His relationship with Marcus had always been something of a mystery to others, given how different the two boys were, but they balanced each other out. Jake was the life of the party, while Marcus was the one who kept them grounded. Susan had always liked Jake. He was polite, respectful, and well-mannered, everything a mother would want in her son's friend. But there was something more to her interest in him that even she didn't fully understand. It started innocently enough, small conversations when Jake would come over to hang out with Marcus, brief moments when their paths would cross in the kitchen or the living room. But slowly, over time, Susan found herself drawn to Jake in a way that made her uncomfortable. Upteep was young, vibrant, and full of life in a way that her own husband, Richard, hadn't been in years. Richard worked long hours as an investment banker in the city. He was a good provider but emotionally distant, and over the years the intimacy in their marriage had faded to a point where it barely existed. They had settled into a comfortable routine. Richard spent most of his time at the office, and Susan threw herself into her work and keeping the house in order. It wasn't that they fought or had a tumultuous relationship. They had simply grown apart, two ships passing in the night. And then there was Jake. He was in her house so often that she had come to know him almost as well as Marcus. But it wasn't until one hot summer day, when Marcus was out with friends, that things between them shifted in a way that neither of them could take back. It had been a sweltering July afternoon, one of those sticky, oppressive days where the heat pressed down on everything like a heavy blanket. The air conditioning in the Reynolds house was a welcome escape from the suffocating outdoors, and Jake had come by, as he often did, to hang out. Marcus had gone to the mall with some of his other friends, but Jake stayed behind, claiming he wasn't interested in shopping. Or Susan had been lounging by the pool, her sunglasses on, a cold drink in hand, trying to enjoy a rare moment of peace and quiet. She was surprised when Jake came out of the house and joined her by the pool, towel in hand. "Mind if I take a dip?" he asked with a smile, his shirt already halfway off. Susan's heart skipped a beat. She quickly averted her eyes, trying to act nonchalant. "Go ahead. It's too hot to do anything else today." Jake's athletic frame glistened in the sunlight as he dove into the water with a graceful splash. He swam a few laps before coming to rest by the edge of the pool, his arms folded over the side as he looked up at Susan. There was something in his eyes, something playful, almost flirtatious, and Susan felt a strange flutter in her stomach. She tried to push it away, telling herself that it was ridiculous, that he was just a boy, Marcus's friend. But then he said something that changed everything. "You look amazing for your age, Mrs. Reynolds," Jake said, his voice smooth and casual, as if he were commenting on the weather. "I bet people think you and Marcus are siblings, not mother and son." Susan laughed nervously, brushing off the compliment. "Oh, stop it, Jake. You're too kind." But the seed had been planted. All for the next few weeks, Susan found herself thinking about Jake more than she should. She felt guilty, ashamed even, for the way her mind kept drifting back to that moment by the pool. She knew it was wrong, that Jake was her son's best friend, but the attention he had given her, the way he had looked at her, she couldn't get it out of her head. And Jake knew exactly what he was doing. He started coming around more often, always finding excuses to stay longer than Marcus, always making little comments that left Susan blushing. He had a confidence that belied his age, a cocky charm that made her feel like a schoolgirl with a crush, and, as much as she tried to resist, Susan found herself drawn to him in ways that were becoming harder and harder to ignore. It all came to a head one evening when Richard was away on a business trip and Marcus was staying over at another friend's house. Jake had come by, ostensibly to borrow a book from Marcus's room, but Susan knew there was more to his visit than that. They ended up sitting in the living room, talking over a glass of wine, the conversation flowing more easily than it ever had before. One glass turned into two, then three, and before Susan knew it, Jake had moved closer to her on the couch. His hand brushed against hers, and she didn't pull away. Her heart was racing, her mind screaming at her to stop, but she couldn't. When Jake leaned in to kiss her, she kissed him back. What followed was a blur of passion, a momentary lapse in judgment that would soon spiral into something neither of them could control. They slept together that night, and when it was over, Susan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, a sick feeling of guilt settling in her stomach. She knew what they had done was wrong, that it was a betrayal of her family, of Marcus, but at the same time she couldn't deny how alive she had felt in those fleeting moments. Jake, on the other hand, showed no signs of remorse. He was confident, almost cocky, as he dressed and left the house, telling Susan that he'd see her soon. He wasn't worried about the consequences. He was young, reckless, and had no concept of the damage their affair could cause. For the next few months, Susan and Jake carried on their secret affair, always careful to avoid suspicion. They would meet when Marcus wasn't around, stealing moments in the house or at a nearby motel. Susan's life became a delicate balancing act, a web of lies and deception that grew more tangled with each passing day. She was constantly on edge, terrified that Marcus or Richard would find out, that her perfect life would come crashing down. But the guilt was eating her alive. She couldn't look Marcus in the eye without feeling like a terrible mother, and every time Richard kissed her goodnight, she felt a pang of shame for what she had done. Yet, despite the guilt, she couldn't bring herself to end the affair. There was something about Jake that she couldn't let go of, something addictive about the way he made her feel. Jake, meanwhile, seemed to revel in the secrecy of their relationship. He would tease Susan about it, making light of the situation, never fully grasping the gravity of what they were doing. He didn't see the long-term consequences, the destruction that was slowly brewing beneath the surface. To him, it was just a game. But it wasn't a game to Susan. As much as she tried to maintain control, she knew deep down that the affair was spiraling out of control. She had tried to break it off with Jake several times, but he always managed to pull her back in, his charm and confidence overwhelming her better judgment. And then, one day, everything came crashing down. It was a Saturday afternoon in late autumn, and Marcus had invited Jake over to help him with a school project. Susan was in the kitchen, preparing lunch, when she heard the doorbell ring. She froze for a moment, her heart racing, knowing it was Jake. When she opened the door, he greeted her with that familiar smirk, his eyes glinting with mischief. But there was something different this time, something darker lurking behind his smile. He brushed past her without a word, making his way into the house, where Marcus was waiting for him in the living room. So Susan tried to keep her composure as she went back to the kitchen, but her mind was racing. She could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken weight of their affair hanging over them like a storm cloud. For the first time, she felt a creeping sense of dread, as though something terrible was about to happen. And then it did. What Indiana did. Evening after Jake left, Marcus approached his mother in the kitchen. He stood in the doorway, his hands shoved in his pockets, his face unreadable. "Mom," he began, his voice low and hesitant, "there's something I need to ask you." And Susan turned to face him, her stomach tightening with fear. "What is it, sweetheart?" Marcus hesitated for a moment before finally speaking. "I've noticed that you and Jake have been acting different lately, like there's something going on. Are you and him involved?" The question hit Susan like a punch to the gut. She felt the color drain from her face, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment she had been dreading. She had always known that Marcus would find out eventually, but she hadn't expected it to happen like this. For a moment, she considered lying, brushing off his suspicions with a casual remark. But the look in Marcus's eyes told her that he already knew the truth. There was no point in denying it. Taking a deep breath, Susan nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry, Marcus." All of the silence that followed was suffocating. Marcus stared at her, his expression a mix of shock, anger, and betrayal. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Susan standing there, her world crumbling around her. As the days that followed were a blur of tension and silence. Marcus avoided his mother, barely speaking to her except when absolutely necessary. He was furious, hurt, and confused, and he had no idea how to process the betrayal he felt. Jake, for his part, acted as though nothing had changed, continuing to hang out with Marcus as though their friendship hadn't been shattered by the affair. But the tension between them was palpable, and it wasn't long before things came to a head. One evening, while Marcus and Jake were hanging out in the basement, the unspoken anger between them finally boiled over. Marcus, unable to contain his rage any longer, confronted Jake about the affair. While the two boys argued, their voices rising until they were shouting at each other. It was a clash of emotions, betrayal, anger, jealousy, all bubbling to the surface. And then, in a fit of rage, Marcus grabbed a nearby baseball bat and swung it at Jake. The blow connected with a sickening thud, and Jake crumpled to the ground, blood pouring from his head. Marcus stood over him, breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't meant for it to go this far. He hadn't meant to kill him. But it was too late. Jake lay motionless on the floor, his once charming face now a mask of blood and lifelessness. Hopeless Susan rushed downstairs when she heard the commotion, her heart racing with fear. When she saw Jake's body lying on the floor and Marcus standing over him, the bat still in his hand, she knew that everything was over. She collapsed to her knees, her mind spinning with horror and disbelief. This was her fault. Her affair with Jake had destroyed everything. Her son's life, Jake's life, their family, it was all ruined because of the choices she had made. The aftermath of the murder was swift and brutal. Marcus was arrested and charged with manslaughter, his life forever changed by the events of that fateful night. Susan's affair with Jake was exposed to the world, and the once perfect life she had built crumbled into ruins. In the end, Marcus was sentenced to 10 years in prison for Jake's death. The trial was over quickly, though it felt agonizingly slow for Susan. The courtroom was filled with the whispers of neighbors, friends, and even strangers who heard about the scandalous affair that had led to murder. For days, the details of her secret relationship with Jake were laid bare before the judge, jury, and, most painfully, Marcus. The prosecutors painted a picture of Susan's betrayal, how her affair with her son's best friend had spiraled out of control, leading to a violent confrontation that ended with one life lost and another ruined. Marcus sat through the trial in stunned silence. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. He hardly acknowledged his mother, as if he couldn't bear to look at her. Susan watched helplessly as her son's world collapsed, knowing that she was the reason for his downfall. The defense had little choice but to argue that Marcus had acted in the heat of passion, driven by the unbearable betrayal of both his best friend and his mother. The prosecution, however, pushed for a harsher sentence, pointing out that Marcus had used a deadly weapon, and whether or not he intended to kill Jake, he had struck him with a baseball bat in a fit of rage. The act itself was undeniable. Despite the defense's best efforts, Marcus was convicted of manslaughter. The judge, taking into account his young age and the emotional trauma he had suffered, sentenced him to 10 years in prison. It was a merciful sentence, given the circumstances, but for Susan it felt like a life sentence. The guilt that weighed on her heart was unbearable. She had not only lost her lover but also her son, and there was no one to blame but herself. As Marcus was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he cast one last glance at his mother. His eyes were cold, filled with anger and betrayal. In that moment, Susan realized that she had lost him forever,